5 minutes on the clock. You ready? Awesome. Let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, the topic for today is DC should be granted statehood. So it's going to be a pretty straightforward case with us just looking at whether or not, with the case presented today, whether or not DC should in fact be granted statehood. Weighing mechanism, cost-benefit analysis. So I'm going to be presenting you benefits. My opponent will be presenting you some cost, and at the end of the day, whichever one you see best ends up winning the round. With that being said, my first contention today is the people want it. The people want it. This is insanely important just because we need to remember the people already support this program. They already want to be a part of the nation. They want to be one of our states. In 2019, the DC Admission Act received 86% support from the referendum. Now, with that being said, my second contention today is just taxation without representation. They pay federal taxes, they contribute to our roads, our infrastructure, but they don't get a voice in how it's actually spent. Most of us get that voice through our representatives or our Congress officials, but with that being said, the main thing, they don't get congressional voting power at all. They have one non-voting House of Representatives member, and they have 0 members in the Senate. They have no representation when it comes to the Senate. Now, ignore the fact that they completely don't have an ability to actually vote on substantive policy issues. They don't get to decide who the agency heads of departments are. They don't get any input in that. They don't get input in either U.S. ambassadorships or federal courts as well. There are major decisions that happen, especially at the agency level, because with the growth of the executive branch, there is so much that happens that they just don't get a say in who is leading those organizations. Now, my third contention today is National Guard. Now, this one's going to come just mostly because of what's happened recently. On January 6th, whenever we had the violent insurrection at the Capitol, we have to realize that the Department of Defense is the one who gets to deploy currently. Who knows how this would have gone if a governor of DC had the ability to take action. If they were able to deploy the National Guard earlier, if it wasn't just left up to the federal government, to the Department of Defense, people's lives may have been saved, and at least the situation would have been handled quicker. That's increasingly important, especially with what happened in general. It would just allow a quick mobilization of forces in these stressful times. But yeah, the main thing we just need to realize is that there's already public support. People already want this. They want to be able to be heard like all of us. Like, we're Americans. We're people who have this fundamental belief that, hey, we should all have a say in our democracy. We should be able to vote for our representatives, and then they represent us in Congress. They represent us in the Senate, in the House. Then we get a say in what's actually happening. But currently, as it currently stands, we do not grant people that ability. We do not grant them the representation that's due. They do have they're able to make their voice heard in the House. But that doesn't mean anything if they can't vote. If they don't have an ability to say, hey, this is what we support, and we are putting our vote behind it. Right now, we're not doing justice by the people of DC. And if we're going to stand by the American principles, we have to grant DC statehood. Just one more time, getting it out there. The people want this. The people strongly stand in support of this, way over a supreme majority. We see that they are not being represented. They have no say in how their tax money is being spent. They have no say in any of that. And there's just so much left out of the hands of the DC people. They are getting minimal representation. But at the end of the day, they don't have the representation that actually benefits them, and they're not able to do anything with that representation because there's no vote behind it. Anyway, with all that being said, I strongly believe that DC should be granted statehood. I stand down for cross-examination.
Can I have a timer?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Of course.
All right. Ready?
Uh-huh.
Do people in this country vote against their self-interest?
What do you mean by that exactly?
Do people in this country ever vote against their self-interest?
I think most people, when they go to the polls, they're voting for what they truly believe in.
Right, what they truly
Yeah.
believe in, but they still often in many states say vote for congressmen that implement things that are against their self-interest, right?
Sometimes their representative may not perfectly represent them, but they do get to vote for who is representing them, and if they don't represent them, they can vote them out.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can also talk about every travesty that's ever happened in this country. They often happen, at least at first, with public support, right?
I don't think Katrina or any national, really big emergency has really had that. So, no.
Okay, but I more mean like segregation often had
Human
really
sorry?
deep public support at first, right?
Yeah, oftentimes people make those bad decisions, but at least they should be able.
So the fact that the public supports something overwhelmingly does not inherently mean that thing is good, right?
Correct, but throughout my case, I show you how it is good. I talk about how the agency heads, they get a voice in how they are being represented.
Sure. Let's talk about taxation without representation,
Yeah.
actually. So DC gets federal funds, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, what exactly pays for those or federal funds and benefits that DC gets?
Taxpayers, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So you could say that DC tax-paying citizens ultimately do see benefits from their taxes, right?
So yeah, of course you're gonna get you're gonna get roads and stuff, but you're not gonna get a say in how your money's spent. You get stuff, but it's not what you directly wanted necessarily.
So they don't want their road systems, their ambulance
They do want
services.
their road systems, of course. But at the end of the day, they may not want the exact way the road system's structured. They may want to choose someone who represents their interests best. Thank you.
Right. Alright, so at the top of my speech, just give you a really brief roadmap. I'm going to talk about the affirmative case and then move over to a couple of negative arguments as to why DC should not be granted statehood. Let's look at the first affirmative argument, which was effectively that people want this. He cites a referendum in which 86% of people voted in support of DC statehood. Now, the first thing that we have to see here is that public support does not necessarily equate to any policy being beneficial or good in general. And so ultimately, this argument doesn't hold a ton of weight. As I allude to in cross-examination, every travesty that this country has ever seen, whether it be slavery or segregation, or even people just voting in representatives that do things against their self-interest, it ultimately is indicative of the fact that just because something has public support behind it does not mean that thing is inherently good or beneficial. Look to his second contention, talking about taxation without representation. He says that DC citizens pay federal taxes but don't get any representation. Now, I have three responses to this. The first is, as the affirmative admits, they actually do have some level of representation. They have one, albeit non-voting member of Congress in the House of Representatives. So effectively, their voices are being heard. They at least have a seat at the table. Just because they don't get to decide what is for dinner does not mean they don't have a seat at the table. So they do actually have representation. But the second thing is these confirmation votes that he alludes to, like ambassadorships and federal judges, are often not particularly contested confirmation votes. A lot of them are confirmed overwhelmingly. So at best, the representation that the affirmative wants to give the people of DC is symbolic. But there's very, very real-world harms that would come to the people of DC if we granted them statehood, which I'll get to in a moment. But my third argument against this is that they're actually very, very much getting their money's worth in terms of their tax money. I talk about how DC's overwhelmingly funded federally. They have the same benefits of all taxpayers, ambulance services, highway funding, things like this. So when he says the phrase taxation without representation, it alludes to like colonial ages in which the United States colonies literally were having their tax dollars basically run away with by the British Empire. This is simply not something that's happening in the status quo with DC. They are seeing massive benefits from their taxes. It simply is not taxation without representation. Now, his third and final argument talks about the National Guard. Basically says that if DC had statehood, they could have prevented, or at least better prevented, the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. But the founding fathers actually already feared statehood of the capital in general in the Constitution and in the Federalist Papers, and saw how DC statehood could be equally problematic. And we can look to how this is kind of already the case, where governors are doing very similar things to what we saw to the lack of action on the Capitol. We see specifically the state of Washington during the Black Lives Matter riots refused to send in the National Guard because the governor, who was a Democrat, saw some virtue or some value in the rioters' intentions and ultimately didn't send in the National Guard to stop them. That same thing can happen if we give statehood to D.C. The governor can ultimately stop the National Guard from being called in if the rioters are doing what he sees as virtuous. It's equally problematic. This problem doesn't actually get solved in either world. It's just a harmful thing that happens sometimes. Now let's move over to the negative case. The first argument for why DC should not have statehood is financial aid. Firstly, and primarily in federal grants. The DC CFO tells us that DC is actually sitting at a very peculiar spot where they're given grants both dedicated specifically to states and local municipalities, like the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families grant and the Head Start grant. And it's specifically because DC is already regarded a little bit like a state in many regards that they're given both state grants and local municipality grants. But if you vote for the affirmative and make them outright a state, they would likely lose these local grants and just be given the ones dedicated specifically to states if they're going to be outright a state. Now, the other financial argument as to why DC should not have statehood is Medicaid expenditures. Currently, the federal government finances 70% of DC Medicaid. Now, this system is normally run on per capita income, but DC has a special sort of exemption because of their financial ties to the federal government. And that's exactly why the federal government currently finances 70%. Typically, it's run on per capita income. DC has the #1 per capita income in the entire country, which means they would get the standard 50% coverage of Medicaid, like other states that have above average per capita income. So if you want to make them a state, they'll be considered like every other state with above average per capita income and only get 50% of their Medicaid funded by the federal government. That is a substantive real-world harm to DC citizens that will come if you favor the affirmative. My second intention is constitutional intention. Now, I alluded to this in my response to his case. It's essentially where James Madison, in both the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, talks about how risky it is for the District of Columbia or the capital at large to have control primarily over the security of our nation's capital. And if you give the National Guard over completely or unilaterally to a governor of the District of Columbia, that is exactly what happens. And we see governors who oppose certain elements of the federal government absolutely have no problem disrupting the security of the nation's capital. We saw this again with Jay Inslee in Washington State, where President Trump pressured him to send in the National Guard to stop the Black Lives Matter riots that were getting very out of control. Because Jay Inslee was ideologically aligned with the rioters, he ultimately didn't do that. We can see the exact same thing as the potential to happen in the District of Columbia. If it was leftist Black Lives Matters rioting in the Capitol on January 6th and a Democratic DC governor, we would likely not have seen the National Guard be called in either way. So it's for those very substantive harms that we will see if we do grant DC statehood that I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes on the clock. All right, ready for cross-ex?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, I just have a couple of questions for you. So what good is representation unless you have a voice in how you're being represented?
So they do have a voice. As we both agree, they have a representative in Congress.
Okay, but can't you agree, if they don't actually get to vote on these issues, they're not actually making any sizable difference?
Frankly, I would take having my Medicaid funded over having a say in who the ambassador to Kenya is.
That's a great point. So you talk about this agreement basically where they have an agreement with the area of DC because of the situation. Couldn't they make another agreement to where they also fund it at 70%, I believe you said?
Yeah, I would say that's relatively unlikely. Just because you're advocating for giving DC total sovereignty as a state,
but why did they do it in the first
those
place?
ties.
Why did they create that initiative?
Because DC is intricately tied to the federal government. They don't
so would
have
they
the
stop
control.
Would they stop being controlled by the federal government?
Yes, because you're advocating for giving them statehood, giving them sovereignty. So that means that the federal government would inherently have less control over the District of Columbia.
They would. Okay. And then one more question I have for it: does it matter who serves at these agencies? Does it matter?
Yeah, of course.
So shouldn't people have a say in that?
Well, yeah, and they do have a say in Congress, and like I said,
But
I
a
would
voting
also
say. Shouldn't they be able to vote for who's representing them at these agencies?
maybe in a perfect world, but
Thank you.
when we're looking at these substantive harms that would come with giving them statehood, I'd value not having those harms.
Okay. Well, thank you. 3 minutes on the clock. A lot to talk about today, but let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm glad we all agree on the top case. Great. Getting into the case, so my first point was talking about the people wanted. He starts talking about how the public support doesn't necessarily mean it's good, talking about issues like segregation. Yeah, segregation's bad, but things like making sure people have representation, are able to vote for their agency leadership, able to protect themselves in times of crisis, that also matters. So that is a good thing overall at the end of the day. Second point I have, when he talks about how like they do have representation, yes, they have someone who can say, I believe in this, but they don't actually have a voice whenever it comes to voting, and thus like there's not much impact to that. He talks about how they do get these benefits. They get the roads funded, they get healthcare funded. Yes, they do, but they don't get a say in how it's actually funded. That is exceptionally important whenever we're in a democracy. These people have the right to have representation that's voting. Not just saying what they believe, but voting for the people they represent. Moving on, they talk about how it's symbolic, the U.S. ambassadorships, federal courts. But there's also real-world impacts of that. And overall, the agency's big enough. Like, ambassadorships, they do tend to be more, like, bipartisan. But, like, definitely with the agency heads, and with all these, the people should be able to have their voice heard. The National Guard talked about how state control is bad to a certain extent because it can take us down a rabbit hole. But I have to say, not inherently. Oftentimes, like as I'll talk about a little bit later on, it can actually have its own harms. First subsection they have, first contention, is financial aid. They talk about these federal grants, how it's granted to state and locals, and like they'll lose aid overall. The main thing I want to emphasize is that they're not actually losing the local. They're just gaining federal representation. They're gaining a say at that level. They still have to have people doing the municipality work. They have to have someone dealing with the zoning laws, dealing with all the local elements. So there's no reason they wouldn't also receive that. So that point drops on their side. The Medicaid element they're talking about, the CFO, his statement, how they have this connection and they give them 70% to the normal 50%. They can come up with a new agreement. They did it in the first place to give these people representation, and it is very close to DC, so they still need that say. 20 seconds left. Going to go into the second contention, the last one. They talk about congressional intent, constitutional intent. They talk about how Trump and RNC, that element, they talk about how these governors can basically do things that isn't enjoyed or problematic. But at the end of the day, these aren't federal events being prohibited, and people can still stand up whenever it's needed. Thank you.
Sorry, just getting everything in order here real quick. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Just for a brief roadmap, going to go back over my case, then look at his case a little bit more, and give you a couple of voters that should make you very, very comfortable signing your ballot for the negative. Now, first looking at my first contention, talking about the federal aid specifically that the District of Columbia gets. Now, in terms of these grants, I basically say they get state grants and local grants. If we put them totally in this, or in this group of just being a certified state, totally sovereign state, totally just completely unadulteratedly making them a state, my opponent says that they essentially won't lose this local aid. They'll still be the city of DC and the state of DC, and this frankly doesn't make any sense because they'll still have the exact same people, exact same boundaries, exact same issues that they did before when they were just a city. It wouldn't make any sense for them to be a city and a state with the exact same boundaries, exact same people, exact same needs. So this rhetoric doesn't really hold a ton of weight, especially when the main affirmative advocacy is to make them totally a state, make them a sovereign state. That's really his advocacy here. So it doesn't make any sense for them to be a city and a state. So the idea that they would lose these local grants still very much is a risk that the people of DC simply cannot risk. Now let's look at these Medicaid expenditures, where I basically say because of the special agreement between the federal government and the District of Columbia, the federal government currently covers 70% of DC Medicaid. My opponent says, well, they could make a new agreement once the District of Columbia is actually a state. Now, this isn't particularly likely to happen. As I allude to in cross-examination, because the federal government is losing that control they currently have over the District of Columbia, which is what incentivizes them to make this deal in the first place. But once you make DC a sovereign state, the federal government loses all this incentive to make this deal happen in the first place. So the likelihood that DC citizens lose all of this funding or a substantial portion of this funding to the Medicaid is still very, very much a risk, and simply not a risk that the DC citizens can afford. Now let's look at the second tension. The main response I get from my opponent here is that these aren't federal events ultimately being stopped. Like when I talk about Roy Cooper and how the governor prevented Trump from using arenas for the RNC convention and rallies, things like this. But the problem here is that a sovereign governor of DC still has a staunch capability to mess with the security of the federal government. They could still shut down streets, not deploy the National Guard if they needed it. Things like that are exactly why the Founding Fathers wanted the DC area, or the capital in general, to be still tied to the federal government, be essentially a federal city, and not be a sovereign state. So a governor doesn't have that immense power to compromise the security of these federal buildings. That's not really something we get a response from on the affirmative side. Now let's go back and look at the affirmative case. Looking first again at his first argument about how the people want it, a couple of things to look here. He basically says it doesn't matter if public support doesn't necessarily equate to something being good. This still is good, and I show you why. He says representation is good. But I tell you again that this representation is largely symbolic. It's voting on things like ambassadorships, on federal judges, which are almost always pretty staunchly confirmed. Like, they're not particularly contested most of the time. And especially when we look at this being in the face of DC citizens losing Medicaid funding, I would certainly take my Medicaid funding over symbolic representation. So that's going to be your first voter for the negative, is any of the benefits like representation the affirmative offers are really symbolic at best, when losing Medicaid funding, losing federal grants are very, very real. Look at his second tension talking about taxation without representation. The main thing I have to say here is that my opponent basically says that they don't have any say over where the money goes, what highways get built. But actually, a lot of this say happens at the local level, and they still have an immense amount of local say, even as a city, and that will stay intact in the negative world. They still have an immense say over how this tax money ultimately gets spent. And that's going to be your second voter, is the local say that DC currently has because of its various agreements with the federal government are very, very impactful. So to say that they are being taxed with no representation, no say in how that money is spent, simply is not true. Your second voter, again, is that the local say is very, very impactful. And his third contention talks about the National Guard. I tell you again, and we don't get a great response from the affirmative side here, is that the having total control under a sovereign DC state is equally problematic. I tell you about Jay Inslee, who even under pressure from Trump, didn't want to deploy the National Guard in Washington state. If Washington, D.C. was a sovereign state, the governor would have the same inclinations to where if he ideologically supported the rioters, he would not be inclined to deploy the National Guard to stop them. We don't get a response to this at all in the affirmative side, and that's ultimately going to be your last voter, is that the safety of D.C. matters, and that's why it needs to remain the federal city. Thank you.
All right, 3 minutes on the clock. Ready? All right, let's get this done. All right. So, great debate, first of all, but I do have three main voters, and they're going to be the end reason why you end up voting for the affirmative after today's debate. So, my first voter today is voting voice. We had this conversation about like policy and like the main thing, like whenever you have a voting voice, you're able to actually say, hey, I believe in this, let's actually vote on this, let's have a debate about this, and let's actually see what we can do. Yes, to a certain extent, they do have some level of input at the state level. And I find it kind of insane that my opponent chooses to say a lot of these situations, like their vote is symbolic. They still are dedicating this policy. They're deciding how to go forward in that. There are real-world impacts, not just in the policy element that my opponent ignores, but also in the real-world examples of like agencies. Deciding how the EPA is ran, deciding how the Department of Transportation is ran. It's important who leads those things, and the people have a right, have like the duty. We have the duty to grant them that ability to exercise that right by electing the representatives who can truly represent them. Moving on, my second voter today is added defense. Now, they talk about this complete control. Obviously, just like any other state currently, the federal government would still have some say into this. But overall, when we're looking at this, just because there have been situations where they haven't addressed it properly, doesn't mean that there will always be situations like that. There's nothing inherent about this. This is like whenever you grant people, like you have to allow people to exercise their rights. And third voter is public support. These are good policies. You should be able to vote on what's happening, and like you should be able to vote on what's going to happen. One element they talk about for a little bit is just how this Medicaid situation where they would receive less funding. Yeah, they might receive less funding until we reach this new agreement, but this will happen likely because they still want to make sure the center of our country, like the main place, still has the resources needed to, so it doesn't fall apart. We have to understand that DC should be granted statehood because the people want it. It's taxation without representation otherwise. And for safety's sakes, after these riots, we have to be voting for DC statehood because they deserve the right to protect themselves and everyone in their area. Thank you. Hey, great round. Great round.